Right, well, good morning once again. Friends, my name is Lisi Schröttner, if I haven't met you yet, and it's a pleasure to be sharing the word with you this morning. I'm sharing my thoughts on this story that we've heard a few times already. Oops, turn that on. There you go. Well, these three words stick out in our story. And in the Book of Belonging, which is the series we're doing right now, these three words pop up. Disbelief, despair, and a feeble hope. Have you ever felt these things? Has anything ever prompted the feeling of disbelief, stopped you in your tracks and left you with eyes and mouth wide open? Has anything ever prompted you to despair, left you feeling drained and with no energy and no desire to get up and continue on your way? Has any circumstance or story given you a feeble hope, not a roaring fire of conviction or optimism, but rather a small, flickering flame that's facing the wind with a bit of determination and the knowledge that it could be gone in an instant? That kind of hope. Have disbelief, despair, and feeble hope ever left you laughing? Well, this is Sarah's story that we've heard this morning. As we heard in Genesis 18, the matriarch, the wife of Abraham, receives the news that she will give birth to a son. The promises of God will be fulfilled, and she laughs. But wait, let's back up a bit. I'm going to spend a bit of time this morning giving some context for this story that we've heard a few times already. This focus story today from Genesis 18 and 21 is actually one of many stories in this long narrative arc of Abraham's family. We call these narrative or family cycles. So in the Abraham cycle, there's this constant dance or tug of war, you might say, of strong faith on one side and soul-crushing doubt on the other side, displayed by more than one character in these stories. The story cycle also contains honorable and some quite dishonorable actions by these very characters. For instance, let's look at the main character, Abraham. Abraham also laughs, and he doubts God on a few occasions, and twice, for his own safety, he tells a foreign ruler that Sarah is his sister, not his wife. Thanks, Abraham. And then on the other hand, so that's maybe not a good example, or an exemplar of faith to follow. But then on the other hand, Abraham, he intercedes for the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, sparing his extended family there. He changes God's mind, which has baffled interpreters for centuries. Abraham shows exceptional hospitality here to the messengers of God, as we heard, rushing to get them the best meal after that humble, let me get you a little morsel, brings out the best meal he could. And then showing them reverence by sitting back and letting them eat as honored guests. In this story here in Genesis 18 that we heard, Abraham is a direct foil to his nephew Lot, whose actions in this book are quite objectively terrible. If you follow along and read in Genesis 19, he is the definition of inhospitality in this book. And again, that's Genesis 19, which I'm not going to get into that there, but Genesis 19 is one of the chapters in the Bible. It's one of the reasons in my university department there was a course called Sex, Lies, and Violence in the Hebrew Bible. And that fills up every term because people are very interested in those subjects. But it's a course about all the difficult, terrible things that we read in the Bible, and we're still in Genesis. So saints, sinners, all of them, all of us, really. The women in the Abraham cycle in these stories aren't necessarily any better than the men. At times, they're disbelieving, they're despairing, and they are feebly hoping with the best or the worst of them. And that's what we learn here about Sarah. So now, since the beginning of their story, Sarah has also been a recipient of God's promises. And she is along for the journey, Abraham's journey. But equally true from the beginning is that she is barren. Right in the family introductions in Genesis 11, and there it is in verse 30, now Sarai was barren. She had no child. It's very clear. Now, What good is a promise of descendants numbering the stars in the sky and the dust of the earth when your body does not cooperate, when your womb is empty? So, left in this predicament, Sarah takes matters into her own hands, and she conceives a plan that will speed up the process. And thus begins the disrepute of Sarah, wife of Abraham and master of Hagar, her Egyptian slave. When she gives Hagar to Abraham to bear a child, and Hagar is pregnant, we see the rift grow between these two women. We don't know their relationship before, but it continues to get further and further away. The fabric of their relationship is torn. The text says that in 16 verse 6, Genesis 16 verse 6, that Sarah dealt harshly with Hagar. And this is the same Hebrew word used in Exodus 1 for Pharaoh's oppressive treatment of the Israelites. So Sarah oppressed Hagar. Wow, Sarah, not exactly an exemplar of, Menno's true evangelical faith. This treatment of Hagar prompts the pregnant Hagar to run away to the wilderness, where she has an encounter with God. And we'll hear a bit more about this next week. Through this encounter, she comes to bear that name of the first and the only person in the Hebrew Bible to name God, El Roi, the God who sees. And then Hagar returns and she bears Abraham's first son, Ishmael. So can we imagine how Sarah felt through all of this? As the one who pulled the strings, I imagine she expected to come out the winner in all of this. So what happened when Sarah took matters into her own hands? Well, Sarah, she gave in to that doubt. She gave in to doubt and the fear and took the road that led to discord and unraveled relationships. But there's more here at stake than Sarah not trusting and resting in God's promises. It is interesting and perhaps exceptional that Sarah took control of this situation, especially in those parts of the narrative when Abraham kind of turns into this obedient husband that says, yes, dear, whatever you want. That happens a few times. That is exceptional. But as I said earlier, in light of the context of these Abraham stories, taking the road that leads to discord and destruction, the road that unravels relationships, is not really exceptional. It is expected. So the fracture between Sarah and Hagar is also not surprising and adds to the profound stakes of this story. This is a story of exploitation, misuse, and mistrust. And not just of Hagar, but Sarah too. But Hagar, she is a slave whose body is exploited to bear a son to fulfill God's promises. Across history, generations of marginalized folks, particularly Black women and slaves, have seen themselves in Hagar's story of mistreatment. But Sarah, too, while having the privilege of wealth, she is barren and has been wandering and wandering for years in the footsteps of her husband. Many Black feminist theologians and scholars have pointed out for decades that both Sarah and Hagar lose in this story because it's a man's world. This story is always about Abraham. That's why I included that last verse in the section, I have borne a son to Abraham. And that's the thing with these patriarchal stories, they always come down to the man. So both Hagar and Sarah, they lose. So it may be asking too much to desire a deep sisterhood in this story. Hagar and Sarah are just a sister away from healing and help. That's the title of feminist scholar, Renita J. Weems. That's the title of this book, but she uses it in her chapter on Sarah and Hagar. Again, that deep sisterhood. Maybe it's an ideal we're reaching for, but they don't act that way as much as we want to see it. The text says that Hagar had contempt for Sarah, and Sarah continues to mistreat Hagar as the story goes on. Acting out of fear and despair, the quiet, feeble hope they each carry doesn't do much good. The stakes are high, nothing's working. So it's no wonder then that Sarah laughs. So we return then to the oaks of Mamre, the story in Genesis 18. We return to that tent filled with tension and heartache, and of course, our most gracious host. Again, Abraham is the very archetype of desert hospitality. So in all the shortcomings in his narratives, here he's doing something right. When the guests are eating, after he's prepared the meal, Sarah overhears their conversation and this baffling statement that she will have a son within the year, the promised heir. Before she laughed, I wonder if there was a brief glance at Hagar and Ishmael, little innocent Ishmael, and a brief moment of triumph in her heart. But then again, she laughs. Triumph turns to disbelief, and her heart voices the fears that she's been carrying for years. Me? There's no way. As Sarah eavesdrops on the conversation between the angels and Abraham, it turns out that God was eavesdropping on her. And then God confronts not Sarah but Abraham, asking why Sarah laughed. Now, there's a bit of a side note, if you'll allow me. In later Jewish writings, rabbis noted this discrepancy between Sarah's initial reaction to the news and God reporting it to Abraham. I don't know if you picked up on that in the couple times we heard this story. Sarah says that I am old and my husband is old. But God only relays Sarah's comment on her age, not Abraham's age. So rabbis thought, did God lie? Did God commit the sin of omission? That's not okay. So here's how the rabbis smoothed it out. So it was taught in the school of Rabbi Ishmael, and this is centuries after the Bible was written. Great is peace, as even the Holy One, blessed be he, departed from the truth for it. As initially it is written that Sarah said of Abraham, and my Lord is old, and in the end it is written that God told Abraham that Sarah said, and I am old. God adjusted Sarah's words in order to spare Abraham hurt feelings that might lead Abraham and Sarah to quarrel. So our God is a God of peace, keeping couples from bickering. Isn't that a nice way to smooth that story? Just thought that was a fun tidbit to add here. Rabbinic commentary is fascinating to read on the Bible. It's like reading a conversation. If you just look that up on the internet, if you see the biblical text, you'll get conversations around it. And it's one rabbi commenting about what this rabbi says, and on, and we get to listen in on that conversation. It's a bit like, if I can say this, reading the comment section online. But this is only much better and a bit more edifying. And my Hebrew profs might not think that's a very good comparison, but that's what I could think of. Anyway, let's get back to the text here. So in this conversation, God says, is anything too wonderful for God? Sarah's fear grows, and she denies laughing. She feels caught. She feels seen, and not particularly in a good way. And that's it. Sarah then disappears from the narrative as the messengers depart with Abraham. It isn't until a few chapters later in Genesis 21 that we read the glad tidings that Sarah conceives and gives birth to Isaac, whose name, as we heard, is related to the word laughter, or God laughs. Here in these few verses at the beginning of chapter 21, we behold a different Sarah. This is now one who has been truly seen by God and has received God's favor. She no longer laughs with derision and disbelief, but with joy and a blossoming hope. In this brief moment, all is well. God has said that Sarah will be called mother, and now that name is hers to hold. So that's our story, and we pause here in the great narrative of Abraham's story. How do we respond to the circumstances around us? What happens when the journey doesn't take you where you expected? Disbelief and despair can lead us to take matters into our own hands. They can lead us to make decisions that ultimately hurt others. People simply become a means to an end that we have been aching for, much like Sarah and Hagar, no matter the cost. Hope flickers and fades until we believe God is no longer with us. As I asked at the beginning, who can resonate with these feelings? So we have all been there. We are all there. We resonate with elements of Sarah, Hagar, and Abraham with their stories because we've all been there. Now, not literally, and I hope not literally, but elements of these very human stories show us that disbelief and despair and doubt have always been part of our experience. Sometimes God hears us, sometimes God laughs with us, and our circumstances change for our good. Sometimes the opposite happens. No amount of praying and pleading will bring about good. We continue to exploit others and send them into the wilderness to die, and we're still not better for it. Our eyes remain locked on our own stories, our own little tent of scarcity, forgetting that our God is a God of abundance. So can we return together to that root of our shared faith and our human story? We are rooted in God, the ground of being and the soil of abundance. So this is the good news and the challenges I want to leave with us today. To remain rooted in these two things, in radical hope and radical hospitality, coming out of these stories of Abraham and Sarah and Hagar. These two things, inextricably linked. And again, they're related to the stories we read across scriptures of Sarah, of Hagar, Abraham, and their descendants, this whole messy story of saints and sinners. So what is radical hope? We remain steadfast in hope, what an author calls gritty, grounded hope, that doesn't deny the difficulty of a situation. It's a kind of hope that can yell or laugh at God with a heart that is hardened by despair. But it's a kind of hope that keeps a heart tender enough to be held and carried forward. What does radical hope look like to you, to us, in these days? Well, maybe it's slowing down and trusting the process, trusting that you're right where you need to be in this moment. When things get hard and you see a shortcut or a way out, take the time to discern if that is the right way and invite others into that process. Let people in, and you might just meet God there. This radical hope leads us to radical hospitality, where we quiet the voices of competition and jealousy and scarcity that say, this town ain't big enough for the both of us, and send the other packing. There is room for all. Radical hospitality pays attention to the voices of abundance and care and tenderness that draws others in and invites them on the journey towards God's dream where all flourish. What does radical hospitality look like to you, to us? Well, this is an important responsibility of the church today, especially when there are so many voices shouting and telling us to tighten up, close up our tents, and shut out anyone who threatens our own story because they're simply not like us. Is that the voice of God? I don't believe it is. In today's world where we're told to look away and ignore, may we look up, see those strangers coming, and be ready to welcome the strangers in our midst. When this feels risky, and there is risk involved, ask wisdom to guide you and make the right decision, but always lead with compassion, not fear. Even if this feels hard, remember that God will meet you there in that place of fear and disbelief and doubt. And God will meet you there to walk as you make that journey. So may we listen to the voice of God and trust in God's true names for us. May we continue to be a place of radical hope and hospitality and continue to be known for these qualities. And when we do find ourselves in those places of disbelief, despair, and that feeble, waning hope, God will meet us there. And may we let God carry us. May you let God carry you. And may we hold each other up and encourage and edify each other. We are on this journey in the wilderness together. So may we carry one another. Amen.